The water was already swallowing Main Street when the laughter finally stopped. Rain hammered the rooftops of Willow Creek. Emergency trucks sat buried to their axles in black mud. A brand-new rescue tractor worth hundreds of thousands of dollars had stalled halfway through the floodwater, its lights flickering helplessly in the storm. Then someone pointed toward the old county road. Out of the darkness came a rusty red Farmall tractor, rattling, smoking, and sounding like it belonged in a museum instead of a disaster zone. At the wheel sat Martha Bellweather, a widow most people had spent years pitying or mocking. The same people who had called her tractor junk now stood ankle-deep in floodwater, watching it pull toward them through the current. And before sunrise, that old machine would save a town that no modern equipment could reach. Before we go back to how that night began, take a moment and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Whether you're on a farm road, in a small town, or in a city apartment dreaming about open fields, we'd love to hear from you. And if stories about resilience, community, and old-fashioned determination still mean something to you, consider subscribing before we return to Willow Creek. Months before the flood, life moved slowly in Jasper County. The town of Willow Creek sat between endless soybean fields and the winding Blackwater River. Most mornings began the same way. Pickup trucks rolled through Main Street before sunrise. The diner opened its doors at 5. The grain elevator hummed in the distance, and farmers checked the sky before they checked anything else. Just outside town stood Bellweather Farm. It wasn't the largest farm in the county. It wasn't the richest, either, but it had survived 3 generations. Martha Bellweather worked the land alone now. At 52 years old, she carried herself with the quiet strength of someone who had learned not to complain. Her husband, Caleb, had been gone for nearly 4 years. A heart attack had taken him in the middle of harvest season, leaving behind unpaid bills, aging equipment, and a farm that suddenly felt much larger than one person could manage. Most evenings, after finishing chores, Martha sat on the wooden steps outside the machine shed and watched the sunset fade across the fields Caleb once worked beside her. Inside that shed rested the one thing she refused to part with: a rusty red Farmall tractor. The paint had faded decades ago. Rust marked the fenders. Oil stains darkened the concrete beneath it. To nearly everyone else, it looked like scrap metal. To Martha, it was Caleb. She could still remember his hands gripping the steering wheel. She could still hear him laughing whenever the old engine sputtered to life on cold mornings. Across the steering column, barely visible beneath years of wear, were 3 carved letters: C. B. Caleb Bellweather. Most people never noticed them. Martha always did. Above the tractor hung a heavy steel chain from an old wooden peg. Nearby sat a weathered toolbox and a faded notebook tucked into a dusty cabinet. They were ordinary objects. At least, they seemed ordinary at the time. Outside, spring rains had begun arriving more often than usual. Along the back wall of the machine shed, a faint water stain stretched several feet above the ground. Visitors rarely paid attention to it. Martha sometimes stared at it longer than she wanted to admit, because every time she did, she remembered something Caleb had once said about the river, something she had never fully understood, and before long, she would wish she had listened more carefully. The next morning began like hundreds before it. Martha was awake before dawn. The kitchen clock showed 4:47 a.m. as she poured coffee into an old enamel mug. Outside the window, a pale gray mist drifted across the fields. The world felt quiet, but not peaceful. There was a heaviness in the air that she couldn't quite explain. After feeding the chickens and checking the cattle, she walked toward the machine shed. The old Farmall sat exactly where it always had. For a moment, she rested her hand on the worn hood. "Morning. Mercy," she whispered. It was a habit she would never admit to anyone. Years ago, Caleb had jokingly named the tractor Old Mercy after it pulled a loaded hay wagon out of a flooded creek when two newer tractors failed. The name had stuck. Martha opened the shed doors wider and let the morning light spill across the machine. A few minutes later, a pickup truck rolled into the driveway. It belonged to 11-year-old Ellie Dawson. Well, technically it belonged to her grandfather. Ellie was simply riding along in the passenger seat. As soon as the truck stopped, she jumped out and ran toward the shed. "Did you get it running again?" she asked. Martha smiled. "It never stopped running." Ellie looked doubtful. "That's not what people in town say." Martha laughed softly. "People in town say lots of things." The little girl glanced back at the tractor. Unlike most people, Ellie loved hearing stories about old equipment. She listened carefully whenever Martha talked about Caleb. Sometimes it felt like the child remembered those stories better than the adults did. Before Ellie could ask another question, a white SUV turned into the farm lane. Martha's smile disappeared. She recognized the vehicle immediately. Jasper County Savings Bank. The SUV stopped beside the barn. A man in a pressed blue shirt stepped out holding a leather folder. Grant Hollis, president of the county bank. He wasn't cruel, at least not intentionally. But numbers mattered more to him than memories, and Bellweather Farm had become a number he could no longer ignore. Ellie sensed the change in Martha's expression and quietly stepped back. Grant approached with a polite smile. "Martha." "Grant, I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." "You already know the answer to that." Grant glanced toward the tractor. His eyes lingered on the rusted fenders. For a second, he looked as though he wanted to say something. Instead, he opened the folder. The review board met yesterday. Martha felt her stomach tighten. The farm loan review wasn't supposed to happen for another month. Something had changed. A cold wind moved across the yard. Even the cattle seemed restless. Grant slowly removed a document from the folder, and when Martha saw the bank letterhead across the top, she knew whatever came next would threaten far more than an old tractor. Grant Hollis did not immediately hand over the document. Instead, he looked across the farmyard. The barn needed paint. Part of the fence leaned slightly near the north pasture. One of the grain bins had a dent from a storm several years earlier. To a banker, those details represented risk. To Martha, they represented survival. Finally, Grant extended the paper. "We've completed the annual review early." Martha took it. The first sentence was enough. Her loan had been moved into a higher risk category. A knot formed in her chest. "You're kidding." "I wish I was." Grant removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. For the first time, he looked tired. "The state auditors are coming next quarter. The bank has to reduce exposure on several agricultural loans." "So, I'm exposure now." "No. You're a customer." "Feels the same today." For a few seconds, neither spoke. The wind rattled the loose metal on the machine shed roof. Grant glanced toward Old Mercy again. "You have options." Martha almost laughed. People always said that right before offering only one. "Let's hear them." "You could sell a portion of the river acreage." "No. You haven't heard the rest. I heard enough. The river acreage was the lowest ground on Bellweather Farm. Most people considered it nearly worthless. Flood-prone, hard to insure, difficult to farm. But Caleb had never allowed anyone to touch it. Grant sighed. You could also liquidate some equipment. Martha followed his eyes, straight to the tractor. There it was. The real conversation. Old Mercy. The machine everyone wanted gone. The tractor isn't for sale. I didn't say it was. You didn't have to. A vehicle approached from the county road before Grant could answer. A shiny black pickup rolled into the driveway. The logo on the door read, Pike & Sons Equipment. Martha's jaw tightened. Nolan Pike climbed out carrying a coffee cup. Tall, confident, always dressed like he had just stepped out of a dealership commercial. He spotted Grant immediately. Morning. Then he noticed Martha. Morning to you too. Neither greeting sounded particularly warm. Nolan walked around the Farmall, studying it. Still keeping this old relic alive. Martha folded her arms. Still selling tractors people can't afford. Grant quietly looked away. Nolan chuckled. Fair enough. He tapped one rusted fender. The metal rang softly. You know, I could put this in our showroom. Martha said nothing. It'd make a great display piece. Folks love nostalgic equipment. It isn't decoration. No offense, Martha, but it isn't exactly a working farm tractor anymore. The words landed harder than he intended, because part of Martha feared he might be right. Repairs were getting harder. Parts were harder to find. And every year the machine seemed a little older, just like the promises attached to it. Nolan pulled a business card from his pocket. My offer stands. Martha never reached for it. After a moment, he slipped it back into his wallet. As Nolan returned to his truck, Grant gathered his papers. We'll need to meet next week. Martha nodded without looking at him. Soon both vehicles disappeared down the road. Silence settled over the farm once again. But not for long. Because that evening, while sorting through old records in the farmhouse, Martha discovered something tucked inside one of Caleb's forgotten storage boxes. A weathered notebook. And across the front cover, written in faded black ink, were 4 words that immediately stopped her cold. For the next flood. The notebook sat on Martha's kitchen table long after sunset. For several minutes, she simply stared at it. Caleb had never been the type to keep journals. He preferred fixing things with his hands instead of writing about them. That was why the notebook felt strange. Important. Almost deliberate. The cover was stained with grease and dirt. Several pages had swollen from moisture years earlier. Martha carefully opened it. The first pages contained maintenance notes for Old Mercy. Oil changes, gear adjustments, fuel mixtures. Nothing unusual. Then she turned another page. A rough hand-drawn map appeared. Martha leaned closer. The drawing showed Bellweather Farm, the Blackwater River, Miller's pasture, and several drainage channels that no longer appeared on modern county maps. Beside one narrow ditch, Caleb had written, "Never let this fill completely." Further down the page, "Town forgot, river didn't." A chill moved through Martha. She continued reading. Many entries referred to the flood of 1979, the same flood that older residents still talked about whenever storms rolled through Jasper County. Caleb had been a teenager then, His father had helped reinforce levees and clear drainage paths. Apparently, he had spent years documenting what happened. Martha flipped through page after page. Water flow directions, elevation notes, old property boundaries, creek crossings, even measurements scratched beside certain fence lines. It looked less like a notebook and more like a field guide. Near the back, she found another sentence circled twice. If the old cut closes, Willow Creek floods from behind. Martha sat motionless. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. She suddenly remembered the water stain in the machine shed. The stain Caleb used to glance at whenever storms approached. At the time, she had never understood why. Now she wasn't so sure. The following afternoon, Martha drove into town. Her first stop wasn't the bank. It wasn't the county office. It was a small white farmhouse on the edge of Willow Creek, the home of Amos Reed, at 83 years old. Amos remembered nearly everything that had happened in Jasper County during the last half-century. If anyone knew about Caleb's notes, it would be him. Amos listened quietly as Martha showed him the map. For several moments he said nothing. Then he slowly nodded. "I haven't seen that ditch marked in years." Martha felt her pulse quicken. So it was real. Oh, it was real. Amos pointed at the drawing. This here was called the Old Cut. "You remember it?" "I helped dig part of it." Martha blinked. "You did." Amos chuckled. "Back before county engineers had computers telling them where water ought to go." His smile faded. "Problem is, most of it got filled in over time. Roads changed, fields changed, folks forgot." Martha looked down at the notebook again. Maybe Caleb hadn't been holding on to old stories. Maybe he had been holding on to something else, something useful, something important. As she prepared to leave, Amos touched one corner of the map. "There was a reason your husband kept this." Martha looked up. What reason? Amos stared toward the dark clouds gathering beyond the fields. Then he answered quietly. "Because he thought someday the river would come back." For the next several days, Martha could think about little else besides the notebook. Every spare moment was spent comparing Caleb's hand-drawn map with newer county maps she found online at the public library. The differences were impossible to ignore. Several drainage routes shown in Caleb's notes no longer existed. Fields had expanded. Roads had been widened. Small ditches had disappeared beneath decades of development. Yet the Blackwater River remained exactly where it had always been, patient, waiting. One evening, Martha drove Old Mercy toward the southern edge of Bellweather Farm. The tractor rattled and growled as it crossed the pasture. The familiar sound stirred memories she had spent years trying to bury. There had been a time when she hated this machine, not because of anything it had done, but because of what it represented. Arguments, money problems, long nights in the shed. Caleb had poured countless hours into maintaining the tractor. Whenever Martha suggested replacing it, he always gave the same answer. New doesn't always mean better. At the time, she thought it was stubbornness. Now she wasn't so sure. Near sunset, she reached the far corner of Miller's pasture. According to Caleb's map, the old drainage cut should have crossed that section of land. At first she saw nothing, just grass, brush, a line of aging fence posts. Then she noticed a shallow depression running through the field. It wasn't obvious. Most people would have missed it. But once she saw it, she couldn't unsee it. The ground dipped gently before disappearing into a stand of cottonwood trees. Martha climbed down from the tractor. She followed the depression on foot. The farther she walked, the clearer it became. The old cut had existed. It had simply been forgotten. By the time she returned home, darkness covered the fields. The next evening, Willow Creek held a county flood preparedness meeting at the town hall. Attendance was unusually high. Weeks of heavy rain across the region had already raised concerns. Martha almost stayed home. She disliked public meetings, especially since Caleb's death. People either treated her with pity or with doubt, sometimes both. But the notebook sat on the passenger seat beside her during the drive into town. By the time she arrived, she had made up her mind. The meeting began with presentations from county officials. Charts appeared on a projector screen, rainfall forecasts, river projections, emergency plans. Then county engineer Lisa Mercer stepped forward. Young, intelligent, and respected throughout Jasper County, Lisa explained that new flood control measures had been installed and updated. Everything sounded reassuring, professional, modern, exactly what people wanted to hear. When questions opened, Martha slowly stood. The room became quiet. She held Caleb's notebook in her hands. "I think there's something missing from those maps." Several heads turned. Lisa looked curious. Others looked uncomfortable. Martha took a breath and opened the notebook. For the first time, she was about to tell the town what Caleb had spent years trying to preserve. But before she could explain, someone in the back of the room laughed. And Martha immediately recognized the voice. It belonged to Nolan Pike. Nolan Pike did not laugh loudly. That almost made it worse. It was a short, quiet sound, just enough for everyone in the room to hear. Martha felt the heat rise in her face. Mayor Dale Whitcomb cleared his throat. "Let's let Mrs. Bellweather speak." Nolan lifted both hands. Didn't mean anything by it, but his smile said otherwise. Martha looked down at Caleb's notebook. For one painful second, she considered closing it and sitting back down. Then Lisa Mercer stepped closer. "What are you seeing on your map?" Martha turned the notebook toward the projector screen. "This cut here." She pointed with one finger. "It runs behind Miller's pasture and toward the lower bend." Caleb said if it closes, water doesn't just rise from the river, it comes around behind town. A few people shifted in their chairs. Ed Sutter, a neighbor who had never liked being corrected, leaned back and crossed his arms. Caleb believed a lot of old things. The room gave a few nervous chuckles. Martha kept her eyes on Lisa. "That ditch still exists. Part of it. Anyway, I walked it." Lisa studied the notebook carefully. To her credit, she did not dismiss it immediately. But Grant Hollis, seated near the aisle, spoke before she could answer. "Is this an official county document?" Martha tightened her grip on the notebook. "No." "Then we need to be careful about treating it like evidence." The word evidence made the room feel colder. Lisa looked uncomfortable. "Mrs. Bellweather, old drainage features can matter, but we'd need survey verification. How long would that take? Longer than a few days? Then you may not have longer." That line did not help her. Several faces hardened. People did not like being frightened, especially by someone they already doubted. Nolan stood. "Look, nobody here wants the town flooded, but we're not going to abandon engineered plans because of a widow's tractor notebook." Martha flinched at the word widow. Not much. Just enough for Ellie Dawson, sitting near the back with her grandfather, to notice. Nolan continued, We've got pumps, loaders, high-clearance equipment, and trained operators. That's what saves towns now. Not forgotten ditches and antique tractors. The room murmured. Lisa raised her hand for silence, but the damage had already been done. Grant looked at Martha with a tired expression, not cruel, worse, concerned, as though she had just proven his doubts about her. The meeting ended with polite applause for the official plan. No one applauded Martha. Outside, rain fell across the parking lot in silver sheets. Martha walked alone to her truck. Behind her, she heard Ed Sutter mutter, "Poor woman hasn't been right since Caleb passed." She stopped for half a breath, then kept walking. Inside the truck, Caleb's notebook rested on the seat beside her. For the first time since finding it, Martha wondered if everyone else might be right. Maybe grief had made her see warnings where there were only memories. Maybe old Mercy really was just rust and stubbornness. Then her phone buzzed. A weather alert flashed across the screen. Blackwater River expected to crest earlier than previously forecast. Martha looked through the windshield at the rain. And somewhere beyond town, in the dark fields behind Miller's pasture, an old, forgotten ditch was filling with water. The rain did not stop. For 4 straight days, clouds hung over Jasper County like a heavy gray ceiling. Creeks overflowed. Roadside ditches disappeared beneath brown water. The Blackwater River climbed higher each morning. At Bellweather Farm, Martha barely slept. She spent her days checking cattle, securing equipment, and studying Caleb's notebook. The more she compared his notes to current conditions, the more uneasy she became. Every warning seemed to be unfolding exactly as he had described. On the 5th morning, she made a decision. If nobody else would inspect the old drainage cut, she would. Old Mercy coughed to life after the second attempt. The familiar engine sound echoed across the farmyard. Martha drove toward Miller's pasture with a shovel, chains, and several hand tools strapped to the trailer behind her. The ground had already become soft. Water pooled across low areas. By the time she reached the old cut, her boots sank halfway into the mud. What she found made her heart drop. A section of the drainage channel had completely collapsed. Years of brush growth, soil movement, and neglect had created a natural dam. Water was backing up behind it, exactly as Caleb had feared. Martha immediately went to work. For hours she cut roots and cleared debris. Mud covered her clothes. Rain soaked her jacket. The work was slow, exhausting, and lonely. Still, she kept going. Late that afternoon, she attempted to pull a fallen cottonwood trunk from the blockage using Old Mercy. The chain tightened. The tractor growled. For a moment, it looked as though the tree might move. Then a sharp metallic crack echoed through the rain. The tractor lurched. Silence followed. Martha's stomach sank. She climbed down and inspected the hitch assembly. One of the old pull brackets had snapped. Not completely, but enough. Old Mercy could no longer handle heavy loads. For several seconds, she simply stood in the rain staring at the damage. The tractor looked tired, older than she had ever noticed before. Suddenly, all the voices from town came rushing back. Sell it. Replace it. It's finished. Maybe they were right. Maybe she had spent years protecting a memory instead of facing reality. By the time she returned home, darkness had fallen. Another problem waited for her. A pickup truck sat in the driveway. Laura Bellweather stepped out. Caleb's daughter, 30 years old, smart, practical, and increasingly frustrated. Laura entered the farmhouse without wasting time. Grant called me. Martha closed the door behind her. He shouldn't have. He was worried. No, he was protecting the bank. Laura folded her arms. Maybe because somebody needs to think about reality. The conversation quickly turned painful. Laura argued that the tractor should be sold. The river acreage should be sold, whatever it took to save the farm. Martha argued back, then stopped, because deep down she wasn't completely sure anymore. Hours later, Laura left. The farmhouse felt emptier than before. Martha sat alone at the kitchen table. In front of her lay Caleb's notebook. Beside it sat her wedding ring. Slowly, she removed the ring from her finger. The next morning, she would sell it to pay for repairs. But before dawn arrived, a warning siren suddenly echoed across Willow Creek. And when Martha rushed outside, she saw emergency lights flashing in the distance. The river had finally reached the town. By sunrise, Willow Creek no longer looked like the town Martha had known all her life. Water-covered sections of Main Street. The lower parking lot behind the grain elevator had vanished beneath muddy floodwater. Emergency crews moved through town with flashing lights and hurried voices. The Blackwater River had broken past every forecast. Sheriff Tom Harlan stood near the intersection by the old feed store, directing traffic away from flooded roads. When he spotted Martha's truck, relief crossed his face. "Martha." She stepped out. "How bad?" Tom looked toward the river. "Worse than they predicted." That answer was enough, because the river was still rising. At the town command center inside the fire station, county officials studied maps and weather updates. Lisa Mercer stood beside a table covered with flood reports. She looked exhausted. Nolan Pike was there too. So was Grant Hollis. Nobody appeared confident anymore. One glance at the room told Martha something important. The plan wasn't working. Lisa noticed her first. "You were right about one thing." Martha raised an eyebrow. "Only one." A tired smile appeared briefly. "The water's moving from behind town faster than expected." No one laughed this time. Not even Nolan. A deputy rushed into the room carrying a radio. "We've got a problem." The room fell silent. "A county transport truck carrying 2 emergency pumps is stuck near the grain elevator." Lisa swore under her breath. Those pumps were supposed to protect the southern district. Without them, entire sections of Willow Creek could flood. Nolan immediately volunteered one of his dealership's newest tractors. Within an hour, the machine arrived. Massive, powerful, modern. Exactly the kind of equipment everyone trusted. A crowd gathered despite the rain. Martha watched from a distance. The tractor entered the flooded area. For a moment, it looked successful. Then the wheels began spinning. Mud swallowed the rear tires. Operators pushed harder. The machine sank deeper. The crowd grew quiet. Soon a second machine attempted the same rescue. It also became trapped. The mud beneath the floodwater was far worse than anyone realized. Sheriff Tom removed his hat. No good. The stranded pump truck remained stuck, and the river continued climbing. By late afternoon, another emergency call arrived. A small evacuation bus carrying residents from the low-road neighborhood had stalled in rising water. Families were trapped, including children. The room inside the fire station changed instantly. This was no longer about property. Now, it was about people. Lisa spread maps across the table. Roads were disappearing one by one. Access routes were failing. Then Martha noticed something. A section near Miller's pasture, close to the old cut. Exactly where Caleb's notebook said water would move. She opened the notebook again. The pages were damp from rain. One sentence caught her eye. The same sentence she had read dozens of times. If the river turns, go before it does. Martha looked up. The answer was suddenly clear. There was still one route left, one machine that might cross it. But first, Old Mercy had to start. And after the broken hitch, she wasn't sure it would. The rain intensified as Martha drove back to Bellweather Farm. Wind pushed sheets of water across the windshield. Tree branches bent beneath the storm. Every mile felt longer than the last. By the time she reached the machine shed, water had already begun pooling near the lower pasture. Old Mercy waited inside, silent, covered in mud from the failed attempt to clear the old drainage cut. For a moment, Martha simply stood there. The tractor looked smaller than she remembered, older, tired, almost fragile, just like her. She climbed into the seat and turned the key. The starter groaned. Nothing. Her stomach dropped. She tried again. The engine coughed once, then died. Outside, emergency sirens echoed faintly through the storm. Martha closed her eyes. In her mind, she heard Caleb's voice. Not as a memory. More like an instinct. A habit learned over decades. She suddenly remembered the final page of the notebook. There had been a maintenance note written beside the words, "Flood Setup." Martha jumped down and opened the notebook. Her hands shook as she searched. Then she found it. Fuel valve. Secondary lever. Low-range transfer lock. 3 simple steps. 3 adjustments Caleb only used when pulling through deep mud. Martha hurried back onto the tractor. She followed the instructions exactly. Then she turned the key one more time. The old Farmall rattled, coughed, shook violently, and roared to life. The sound filled the shed, a deep mechanical growl that seemed impossible for a machine its age. For the first time in years, Martha smiled. 40 minutes later, Old Mercy rolled into Willow Creek. People stopped what they were doing. Nobody laughed. Nobody joked. They simply watched. The rusty tractor moved through water where larger machines had failed. Its weighted wheels dug deep into the mud beneath the flood. Its low gears kept steady traction. Slow. Relentless. Exactly as Caleb had designed it. At the stranded evacuation bus, Sheriff Tom waved frantically. Children pressed against the windows. Parents looked terrified. Martha attached the heavy steel chain. The same chain that had hung in her machine shed for years. The chain everyone thought was useless. The tractor strained. Water surged around its tires. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the bus moved, only an inch. Then another. A cheer erupted. Slowly, steadily. Old Mercy pulled the bus toward higher ground. The crowd stared in disbelief. Next came the pump truck, then another vehicle. One by one. The old tractor succeeded where modern equipment had failed. Even Nolan Pike stood speechless. But Martha wasn't finished. She pointed toward Miller's pasture. The cut. Lisa Mercer immediately understood. Together they headed toward the blocked drainage channel. Using an old drag blade attached behind the tractor, Martha began opening the final obstruction. Mud exploded into the floodwater. A new current formed, then another. Suddenly, water began rushing through the forgotten route Caleb had mapped years before. The river was finally moving away from town. But as the pressure increased, a terrible metallic scream came from beneath Old Mercy. And Martha knew something inside the tractor had just broken. Old Mercy shuddered hard enough to throw Martha against the steering wheel. The engine kept running, but the sound had changed. It was no longer the steady growl Caleb had trusted for years. Now there was a deep knocking beneath the hood, a wounded sound. Lisa Mercer ran toward the tractor through knee-deep water. Shut it down. Martha did not yet. She looked toward the drainage cut. The channel was open, but only halfway. Water rushed through it, brown and violent, carrying branches, trash, and pieces of broken fence. If she stopped now, the blockage could settle again. The town might still flood from behind. Martha pressed the clutch and eased Old Mercy forward. The tractor groaned. Nolan Pike shouted from the bank, "You're going to destroy it." Martha heard him. She simply kept moving. For the next 10 minutes, Old Mercy dragged the blade through the last section of mud and brush. Each pass sounded worse than the one before. Metal knocked. Steam rose. The exhaust coughed black smoke into the rain. Then, finally, the old cut opened wide. The floodwater found its path. A roar moved through the field as the backed-up water broke loose and surged away from Willow Creek. People on the road watched in stunned silence. Lisa looked down at her map, then at Caleb's notebook, then at Martha. Her face said what nobody else had yet found words for. Martha had been right. Only then did Martha pull the throttle back. Old Mercy rolled another few feet. Then the engine gave one final hard cough and died. The silence that followed felt enormous. Rain fell on the tractor's hood. Water curled around the wheels. Martha sat motionless, both hands gripping the steering wheel. The carved letters beneath her palm were slick with mud. C. B. For a moment she could not move. Then Sheriff Tom waded out and helped her down. Across the field, people began clapping. Not loudly at first, just a few scattered hands. Then more. Even Ed Sutter removed his cap. Nolan Pike stood beside one of his sunken machines, his face pale with embarrassment and something closer to respect. Grant Hollis arrived near sunset, soaked through his expensive coat. He looked at the rescued bus, the pump truck, the reopened cut, then at Martha. He did not mention the loan. Not that night. Instead, he said quietly, "Caleb knew." Martha looked at him. "No," she answered. "He remembered." By morning, Willow Creek was still damaged. Several homes had flooded. The feed store basement was ruined. Bellweather Farm had lost fencing, hay, and part of the lower barn wall. Old Mercy remained in the mud, silent and broken, but the town was still there. And when Ruth Ann from the bank called Martha before noon, her voice trembled with urgency. "Martha," she said, "you need to come in. I found something in Caleb's old loan file." The bank looked different after the flood, not because the building had changed, because the people inside it had. When Martha arrived, Ruth Ann Weller was already waiting with a thick folder spread across a conference table. Grant Hollis stood nearby. For once, he seemed uncertain. Ruth Ann carefully slid several documents toward Martha. "I found these while reviewing Caleb's original loan records." Martha adjusted her glasses. The papers were old, much older than the current loan. Attached to them was a county agreement signed nearly 20 years earlier. Caleb Bellweather. Jasper County. Flood control easement. Maintenance obligations. Martha frowned. What is this? Ruth Ann pointed to a highlighted paragraph. The county had received legal access to maintain the drainage route crossing Bellweather Farm. In return, maintenance payments and repair reimbursements were supposed to continue over time. But somewhere over the years, records had been lost. Departments changed, officials retired. The agreement had quietly disappeared into storage, until now. Lisa Mercer was invited to review the documents. After several days of verification, the county confirmed everything. The old cut that helped save Willow Creek had never been officially removed from the flood control system. It had simply been forgotten, just like Caleb warned. The discovery changed everything. Not magically, not completely, but enough. The county approved overdue compensation for maintenance failures. The bank restructured Martha's loan. Foreclosure proceedings were suspended indefinitely. Bellweather Farm survived. The victory still came with a price. Part of the lower barn had to be rebuilt. Several acres remained damaged, and Old Mercy required repairs far beyond what Martha could afford. One afternoon, Nolan Pike arrived at the farm carrying a toolbox. Martha watched him step out of his truck. "What are you selling today?" Nolan smiled awkwardly. "Nothing." He looked toward the silent tractor. "I was hoping you'd let me help." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Martha nodded. Together they walked toward the machine shed. Weeks later, Willow Creek held a community gathering near the town square. No speeches had been planned, but people kept telling the story anyway. The story of the flood, the forgotten cut, the old notebook, and the rusty tractor. Children climbed onto hay bales while neighbors shared food beneath clear autumn skies. For the first time in years, Martha felt something close to peace. Not because everything was fixed, because it wasn't. Life rarely worked that way. But when she returned home that evening, she found Ellie Dawson sitting beside Old Mercy. The little girl was carefully wiping dried mud from the faded hood. Near the steering wheel, the carved initials remained visible. C. B. Ellie smiled. People don't laugh at it anymore. Martha rested a hand on the tractor. No. The machine would never run quite the same again. Neither would she. But both were still standing. And for now, that was enough. Sometimes the things people dismiss are the very things that carry us through our hardest days. A rusty tractor, a forgotten notebook, an old promise, a piece of local knowledge nobody bothered to remember. For years, Martha Bellweather lived with the feeling that the world had moved on without her. The town saw an aging machine. The bank saw a risky loan. Others saw a widow who couldn't let go of the past. But what they failed to see was the experience hidden inside those memories. And maybe that's why stories like this stay with us. Because most of us have known someone who was underestimated. Someone who spoke quietly while louder voices took over the room. Someone who kept showing up, even when nobody believed them. Maybe that person was a parent, a grandparent, a neighbor, a farmer, or maybe it was you. If this story reminded you of someone, we'd love to hear about them in the comments. And if you haven't already, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. One of the best things about these stories is seeing people from small towns, farms, ranches, and communities across the country gathering around the same campfire of storytelling. If you enjoyed spending time in Willow Creek and following Martha's journey, please consider leaving a like, sharing your thoughts below, and subscribing for more stories of resilience, forgotten wisdom, family farms, and the people who refuse to quit when life gets difficult. Until next time, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and never be too quick to overlook something simply because it looks old. Sometimes the oldest things still have the strongest pull.